Good day to you. This video may make it look like I'm still in a cabin in Delaware, but this is actually my home. And last night when I picked up my wife and my two kids from California, which I didn't want to go to because of the explosion of the coronavirus out there in recent weeks, my wife's family is from California, so they were visiting. At any rate, I picked up my family and they talked about the story of my son who's in the medical marijuana certificate program here at ESU, and they left his grandparents' house to take a walk, and they ended up smoking some pot, which is legal in California. It's recreational legal. And when they got back, apparently some neighbors had seen them on surveillance cameras and reported to Dan and Lois, the grandparents, that there were kids, quote, smoking dope outside. So when they got back to the garage of Dan and Lois, my son's grandparents, there was a lot of talk, but it wasn't about that. There was a lot of talk that were questions like, what were you doing outside? And my son said, oh, we saw Tyler, person who's in the neighborhood. And the grandparent, Dan, said, Tyler doesn't live here, and went inside. Now, what happened there was really a conversation about the incident of smoking marijuana, which is not acceptable in that household. And it takes knowing Dan and Lois to know that they're from a different generation, and marijuana is perceived to be a drug along the same par as heroin. And so it's not acceptable to them. But the way that they expressed it is what we might call a high context cultural form of expression, because it's just understood that their belief system does not permit that. And when it came to the incident happening that they were upset about, they weren't going to talk about it directly. So this is my way of introducing what we're talking about in class today. We're talking about context, perception, and ultimately competence. We're talking about these two twin features of intercultural communication, context and perception, so that we can achieve some competence when we communicate with others, so that we are not left confused or in this case disturbed by what happened between my son and the family. It's just the way the communication is taking place because of the context and perception. It's important for you as a person who hopefully is striving to be able to communicate as effectively with others as you can in life, especially including with people who are very different from you, who are interculturally different. It's very important that you develop competencies that are described in this chapter. Competency means it's something that you're good at, you're adequate at, and you can perform because you have a set of skills. So let's talk about those two main terms to start things off: a high context versus a low context culture. This idea really arose with Stuart Hall, who is a Jamaican scholar, very important to the field of communication. He had a book called The Silent Language. So it's his book that's used to help start this study of high and low context culture. And also the U.S. put out a law in 1946 called the Foreign Service Act, which recognized these two ideas of high context and low context when you look at different cultures. Basically, a low context culture is a culture in which very little of the meaning is defined by the context, by looking around, by knowing, by reading other people's nonverbal communication. That's all context, right? Instead, the meaning comes from direct statements, what is stated directly, what is written directly. In a low context culture, if my son had walked back into the garage, the grandfather would have said, hey, you were smoking pot outside of my house, and that's not okay. That's a very direct oral form of verbal communication directed at addressing the situation. That's a low context culture. In a high context culture, it's a culture in which the context creates most of the meaning. You know through tradition, you know through social relations, you know from people's nonverbal communication how you are expected to act. If you go to France, one of the craziest things as an American is to get in trouble for walking on the grass. Yeah, as my French friend Francois says, we French have a very funny thing about the grass out here. They kind of treat it like botany. It's kind of like a flower. You don't walk on flowers. Right? Each leaf of grass is beautiful in and of itself in France. And yet there are no signs anywhere that say keep off the grass. It is the quintessential example of a high context culture. It takes really being French to know that that is just not acceptable to walk on the grass. And so when you do, somebody comes over and they do these kind of nonverbal things to you, and still you have to figure it out. Oh, not allowed to walk on the grass. So when you meet a new person, especially a person from another culture, even within your own country, a person who's radically different from you in many ways, at that moment, there's very, very low context. So much of the conversation is very explicit. Do you like the New York Yankees? Yes, yes. Do you like pasta? Yes, yes. Um, Not much of the conversation is contextual, but over time, as you get to know people, you start to have more of a high context relationship, and that's why societies, particularly ancient societies, China is the culture that we've talked about so far that has a 4,000 year history. China has all this history of context. So it's a very, very high context culture, whereas the US, very new country, very low context. That's why we have signs like keep out, private property, no children in the restaurant. That we were very, very direct. Now let's move on to the concept of face. The concept of face plays a role in context. So face is basically, the saying, I need to save face. That's what this is about. Face, if you look at it from the Chinese point of view, it's made up of really two components. It's got lien, Lien, which is the Chinese term for the physical face. And then you got mien, Mien, which is the Chinese concept for image. And it describes both these dimensions about face. Saving face involves actually your face, right? And also involves the image of the personality that's coming across. So what happens in cultures where you have, I'm not going to call it a conflict because Asian cultures often don't let it get to the level of conflict, but let's say you have a disagreement or there's some awkwardness. How is that going to be resolved? In high context cultures, usually mediators and people who try to solve things are friends. So let's say you have a daughter in a traditional family and the daughter wants to date, and the parents are not allowing that to happen in a traditional family until she's older. And maybe even in some societies like India, the parents want to play a role in actually selecting that person's mate. And so there's a conflict where the daughter wants to find somebody else or wants to date on her own when she's ready. Fixing that situation, if fixing is the appropriate word, would probably be handled by a family friend trying to provide a way for both of them to understand each other. So this is the way that face is often saved in those kinds of situations. In a low context culture, instead, personal responsibility is what is expected. And so in that situation, if a daughter did not agree with the parents, then she may just say, I'm going to move out, I'm going to pay for my own apartment, I'm going to provide for myself, and I'm going to be in charge of my own life. So low context culture is personal responsibility. The idea of saving face is not as great. I have a friend from Lebanon, and he says that you would never, ever criticize a person in public in Lebanon in front of other people. You would not say, as I said once to my son when he was in front of his friends, I said, hey, you didn't clean up the basement today. You were supposed to, that's where he lives. You're supposed to clean up the basement. Now, he was upset, not because I told him to clean up the basement, but because I did it in front of his friends and he lost face. It made him look like a kid, right? That's what we're talking about here. All right, I'd like to move on now. We're going to go on now to perception, another important competency that you need to develop if you want to be able to communicate with people who have intercultural differences. So perception is a two-stage process. You've got sensing and then you've got perceiving. So let's break those down. And you've probably had these in an intro communication class discussed in another context. So sensing is a neurological process. It's going on all the time where your five senses have the capability of pulling in stimuli. Like, I don't know if you can hear right now. Can you hear the air conditioning in my room? I don't know if that's coming across on the microphone, but that air conditioning has been present during the whole video. But it was only until I pointed it out, if you can hear it because of the microphone, that I'm now forcing you to be able to recognize it, to be cognitively aware of it, because sensing goes on under the radar all the time. It's constantly coming into you. William James, the great social historian in the United States, he said that sensing comes to us as an unpacked state. An unpacked state. So it comes to us just like a glob of stuff. And if you look at the Chinese view of sensing, it's more about harmony. It's more about, are the things that are happening around us that we're absorbing, are they creating a oneness with the world, a feeling of peace? Whereas the Western view is more about personal agency. It's more about, is our sensing enabling us to take control of our own individual lives? So sensing is a very neurological process. There's not a lot of cognitive thought involved. It's just happening all the time. It's the next stage that becomes more important in the state of perception. That's the stage of perceiving. And perceiving itself has three subcomponents. It's got selection, organization, and then interpretation. So when you are perceiving, your first step is selecting the stimuli. What are you going to pay attention to? When you cross the street, what are you paying? Are you looking at the house across the street? Are you admiring the garden and the house across the street? No, you're watching for a car so you don't get run over. You're looking at the traffic signal, whether it's green or red, to know whether you can go. You're looking at the crosswalk to make sure you walk across the street. Well, some of us do that as non-jaywalkers, to make sure that you walk across the street at the appropriate place. We're looking at all the available things that we could take in, and we are selecting. There's a very interesting study that I show in my class. I'm going to provide the video link in my email of this. It was a study done where a film was shown with basketball players, and the audience who was watching the film or the video was asked to count how many players there were. And it had these players dribbling the ball and passing it all over the place really fast. And in the middle comes out a person in a gorilla suit and walks across. And if you've been asked to focus on counting the players, then this next step of selection of stimuli is you're selecting just the passing of the ball and the number of players, and you're not selecting the gorilla. It's out of your range. So selection is a very important part of perceiving. But next up is organization. And organization is where we group like things together. When we go to another country, we look around, we say, you know what? They drive on the right-hand side of the road here. So that's like us. If you were in England, it would be the opposite, or St. Croix, it would be the opposite, people driving on the left-hand side of the road. Grouping objects together is the next step that we do when we are perceiving. We are organizing. We're putting ideas to say, that's like kind of like what, the Day of the Dead celebration in Mexico, where they celebrate ancestors and they bring out food and they put it on the table and they have these skeleton images. You've seen the Day of the Dead, haven't you? That's kind of like our Halloween. Yeah, I'm organizing, seeing that, and trying to make sense of it. From sense, kind of like our Halloween. Our Halloween is kind of has this mystical, ancestral element to it. Even though it has more to do with costumes, there are some similarities there. And so that introduces the third step of perceiving, which is interpretation. Interpretation is where we assign meaning to what it is that we have selected and organized. We assign meaning. And this is where we often trip up if we don't have intercultural communication competence. I mean, if you hear that people in India are starving, and India has a lot of poverty, and yet they won't eat cows, a lot of people say that is absolutely crazy. I mean, not everybody is a vegetarian. I mean, why can't they eat? Every day people in the United States are eating the number one meal, which is a hamburger or a cheeseburger. That's coming from a cow. So why can't they do that in India? Well, guess what? They have a different view of cows. Cows are sacred, according to the Brahmin religion, and not to be eaten. And they're saying, well, why in the United States do you eat cows? And we're in the United States are saying, why in France do you eat rabbits? And people in France are saying, why in Korea do you eat dogs? Yeah, one way of looking at this is to interpret it and say, those cultures are barbaric. Of course, dogs shouldn't be eaten. They are domestic animals. They're part of the family. But if you look at it from their perspective, animals have certain signifying meanings to different cultures. Some meanings can be religion. Other meanings can be that this is a matter of survival. It's either the dog survives or I eat the dog to survive. So the whole idea of pets as food is a good example of describing how interpretation takes place. Now let's move on more completely to discuss intercultural communication competence. And again, we're trying to achieve competency so that when we interact with others, that we can have a purpose to our conversation, that we can have understanding, and that we can feel good. So the first area of this intercultural communication competence that you should be able to cultivate is personality strength. And I ask you to assess your own personality strength. It consists of your self-concept. Do you know who you are? Are you happy with who you are? Are you confident that you know who you are? It's all about self-concept, what you think of yourself. Next up is self-disclosure. That's how much private information do you tell about yourself? And sometimes I meet people, and within a couple minutes, they're talking to me about things that make me feel a little bit uncomfortable. I don't know them well enough to know about their relationship problems or their drug dependencies or their mental illnesses. All of that I certainly want to get to know, but when you first meet somebody, it can be overwhelming if that's the kind of things that they talk about. At least to me, that's self-disclosure, and that's knowing how far to go with it. Next up is self-monitoring. Do you have the ability to step outside of yourself and see yourself while you're communicating? Do you perceive how you come across with your nonverbals, your tone, your words? Do you perceive how others may be perceiving you? That's what self-monitoring is about. And lastly is social relaxation. If you have anxiety, are you able to keep that somewhat hidden when you interact with others so that they are not made more anxious? And when you're in a foreign country, it can be unnerving. I remember when I arrived in Ghana, I went outside the airport and I was like, okay, I have to get a taxi. And I waited, and a guy came over, official. He goes, okay, you have to come stand over here, and now you have to tip me. And I was like, okay. So I went over and I tipped him, and he walked away. And I thought, that was the greatest scam I've ever encountered, but it was totally harmless. And I did exactly as I was told. I did exactly as I was told because I'm trying to hide the fact that I was extremely nervous about what was going to happen to me if I didn't come stand over here. I was in a foreign country all by myself in a radically different country in a continent that I had never been to before. But I think I hid the anxiety pretty well because the taxi came and I went to my hotel. All right, next up is communication skills. Communication skills, this is what our field is all about. It's the verbal and non-communication skills, the message skills, the ability to adapt to your behavior. To be able to, especially when you travel to other places where the customs are different, to be able to, you get a soda in Europe, almost anywhere in Europe, and it hardly has any ice in it. And you can be really upset because you're so used to drinking that ice cold soda. Or you can say, I'm just going to drink it as they do. And plus it's in a smaller glass than we usually get. And then next up is social skills. The ability to communicate with people and feel at ease, have fun, joke around, not be awkward. All right, next up, we're moving on to the concept of third culture. Third culture is going to apply to many of you in this class. Third culture is the result of two individual cultures coming together, usually through families, but sometimes through territorial disputes. Two cultures coming together, and what is produced is not just a fusion of the two cultures, but it's a brand new culture, like a Tex-Mex culture. There's a lot of food that's described as Tex-Mex. It's like you can have a burrito, but it's got some spicy barbecue sauce in it. That's Tex-Mex. It's a new culture that's emerging. Many of you in this class are the result of emerging two parents who have come from different cultures, and they produced you, and you are a representative as kind of a third culture. Our own acting president at East Stroudsburg University, Ken Long, he's starting next month, he divulged in the video that went around to all ESU students, I hope you watched it, talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and about diversity and about tolerance. There were two videos that were sent around, produced by a communications student, Zuri Redmond, who is actually the Black Student Union president. And in this video, Ken Long divulged that he has a Puerto Rican wife, and he's a black male. So I can imagine that they have kids. They have 3 kids. He talked about his daughter. So that daughter is a representative of the brand new third culture that's coming about. There are studies that have been performed by Iwama, Japanese researcher, and he found that third culture kids that come from two cultures blended together, they tend to be more self-confident, and they're more curious about travel and having bilingual ability. You think about yourself. Do you speak another language? Are you afraid? You say, oh, no, I could never do that. I'm just going to stick with English, and actually maybe it's going to make me not travel that much. You would be more likely not to be a third culture representative if that's the way that you think. Now let's move on to multiculturalism. The next term, we at ESU, like many universities, have an Office of Multicultural Affairs. Multiculturalism is the idea that we should celebrate and tolerate the differences between our cultures. That when we see that people dressing very differently, worshiping very differently, eating very differently, behaving very differently, that we should not see that as a sign of dissension and tenseness and irritation, but instead, to an extent, I mean, we wouldn't want somebody who comes in with a violent past, to be causing crime. We wouldn't be, we need to be tolerant of that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a tolerance of people based on the cultures that they grow up in. And multiculturalism is a field of study. It got started by the Canadian Royal Commission. They put out a report on Indigenous peoples in Canada and respecting the fact that Indigenous peoples are going to want to live differently. They're not going to worship a Christian God. They're going to look at earth, wind, sun, and earth, wind, fire, the four elements of the earth, wind, fire, water. They're going to look at the four elements of the earth. Some Indigenous peoples, that's how they celebrate and look for meaning in life. That's what multiculturalism is about. It's not, that's primitive, that's barbaric. No, that's their own individual, their own group way of approaching the meaning of life. Now I'd like to move on to post-ethnic cultures. This is kind of taking the idea of multiculturalism and putting it into a futuristic, idealistic sense. It's saying that we need to go beyond culture. You need to get beyond your culture. You need to have a challenge to. What post-ethnic culture is? It's a challenge to the right way, quote, the right way to act, and it's a challenge to tradition. Many people, when they look at Mexico when they first get down there, they say, this place is really dangerous. I see cop cars with lights on everywhere. But what's going on there? Well, Mexico has a very different opinion of the role of police, and I think it's kind of instructive in the conversations that we're having as a nation now about policing. Mexico's view is, if the police are in the neighborhood, we want you to know so that you feel safe. How are we going to let you know? Not by sirens and that makes people feel uptight. Instead, we're just going to have the lights on and the cars going around so that if you need a police car, it's right over there because you just saw it a few moments ago and it shows you there's a police presence. Do you not feel safer? In our country, we don't have that. You could have a police car around the corner in your town. You don't know it because it's quietly there. And so if you need it, what good is that? So post-ethnic cultures is going beyond. It's going beyond considering that the right way to do things is the way that your culture does things. It's just considering that there are other ways and that they have merit as well. And finally, we're going to wrap up now with intercultural communication ethics. Intercultural communication ethics, and this is based on 4 principles that are trying to get people to exhibit ethical behavior in interacting with others, especially when you perceive differences. So the first principle is to address cultures with the same respect as you would like to receive. I mean, that would actually be known as a Christian principle in our country. Treat others as you would like to be treated. And what the wording is in the Bible, I'm not a religious person, but it's the idea that you should always put yourself in the place of somebody else. And if they're being treated, when you call a customer service representative and you're really mad, if you were the customer service representative, would you want you speaking to you that way? That's one way to think about this. Next as a principle is do not deliberately mislead people. The Swedes are incredibly direct. If you make a meal for a Swedish person and you say, how do you like it? In America, we'd be very, oh, yeah, it's yummy, yummy, even if inside it's like, oh, I didn't like that at all. The Swedes will say, well, I thought the red sauce was too tangy, if they believe it. That's an example of an ethical behavior according to this principle. They're not misleading. They're not pretending that the meal was not exactly as they're liking. It's not more about being polite. It's about being direct. And they don't always make negative comments, but it's just an example of the Swede, or a typical Swedish behavior, I should say. A third principle of being ethical in your intercultural communication is to encourage others to express themselves in their uniqueness. Don't try to get them, to be like you are. I'll never forget when I moved from Texas to California. It was a really radical and very tough transition for me because I came from the South. Sorry, when I moved to Pennsylvania from Texas. I also moved to Texas from California. But when I moved to Pennsylvania from Texas, the South is very different from the North, and I had a lot of South in me. And we used to wear these shoes down there because I lived next to the Gulf of Mexico that were called boat shoes. Today they're called Vans, canvas shoes, but they were called deck shoes, and I wore them to class, but that was not cool in the 1970s. In the first day of class, somebody, hey Rob, nice fag shoes. It was devastating to me. It was obviously a homophobic slur, but it pointed me out in front of the whole class. And what we're talking about here is when you recognize difference, is not to call it out as something that's crazy, strange, or wrong, but to celebrate that uniqueness. That's a principle of ethical intercultural communication. And finally, and this one I have a little bit of difficulty with because it kind of goes against the grain of some of the book, the final principle is to emphasize commonalities of cultural beliefs and values, to emphasize what we have in common. Okay, you are a Muslim and I'm an atheist, but we both have the idea of dignity and honor as being important in the way that we treat people. I mean, that's emphasizing commonality, but differences should be celebrated. The differences should be acknowledged and separated, and saying that you are different from me and I'm different from you is okay if there's mutual respect. So I have a little bit of a problem with that one. At any rate, that's going to wrap up the chapter on, the three big things that we talked about. We talked about context and perception, and both of these fitting into competence and how we can develop intercultural communication competence. There's a lot more examples in the chapter from cultures that you can pick up on your own. Have a great day.